So we have different neurons, and rather we have the neurons in our brain. They use different chemicals, and these chemicals are called transmitters. And some of them you might be familiar with, such as epinephrine or dopamine. And so a neuron's main job is to generate this electrical signal called an action potential. And that's basically how our brain functions. An action potential travels down the nerve cell at about 60 miles per hour. That's almost 100 kilometers per hour. So here's a three-dimensional image of a collection of neurons. On the right side, you'll see that. And that's what neurons look like when they're firing or when they're on. And that's when communication is happening. Each of these billions of axons, or wires, are generating a small electrical charge. And that total power has been estimated to equal a 60-watt light bulb. So even though our brain is only about 2% of our body weight, and only about, as I said, 3 pounds, it uses 20 to 30% of the calories that we consume. That's huge. So we really need to think about feeding. When we eat, we're really feeding our brain. So some people may think that the complexity of the brain is comparable to one big computer. You may think yes, you may think no. Well, here's the answer to that. Actually, the brain equals many computers, actually millions of computers working together simultaneously, just like the internet. And similar to the internet, which is constantly changing based on its need, our brain is also changing, and that is a subject matter, one of my new favorite subject matters, which is brain plasticity. It's a branch of neuroscience that talks about how our brain changes as we think differently. So that's a whole other topic, but basically our information in our brain travels at about 268 miles per hour, or 431 kilometers per hour. So we've got 100 billion nerve cells. Now, it may be difficult to imagine this, so let's compare it with the entire phone system for the planet. If we took all the phones and all the phone wires in the world, there are about 4 billion people on the planet, the trillions of connections and messages per day would not equal the complexity and activity of a single human brain. We have more connections in our brain than there are in the known universe. And in the known universe, because the universe is vast and mostly unknown, but what we know about the universe, we could compare that to the connections in our brain. And another way to imagine this, to imagine 100 billion nerve cells, is to think of the number of trees in the Amazon forest. Each cell is connected to about 10,000 others. So the total number of connections in our brain is the same number as the leaves in the rainforest, about 1,000 trillion. Pretty impressive, I'd say, for our brain, for that cauliflower-shaped thing. A piece of brain tissue the size of a grain of sand contains 100,000 neurons and 1 billion synapses, all talking together, all talking to one another. I wonder what kind of phone plan they have. Okay, so in addition to nerve cells, let's move along here. In addition to nerve cells, let's look at the larger parts that contribute to the sophisticated function of our brain. The brain sits on top of the brain stem, which is kind of similar to this cauliflower buddy over here. So there's a stem right there, Okay, right there, and we actually have that at the bottom of our brain. So, and then the brain basically sits on top of the brainstem, and the brain has several subregions. And for the purpose of this presentation, I'll be referring to the cerebral cortex and the limbic system. So the cerebral cortex, which covers the surface of our brain, and that's the newest part of our brain, it controls, as you can see, memory, perception, higher cognitive functions, such as our ability to concentrate, reason, think in abstract form. And its folded surface, that sort of convoluted folded surface, allows for as many neurons as possible to fit within the confines of our skull. So for this reason, the brain has to fold over itself many times, and that's what gives its wrinkled appearance. So if the cerebral cortex was folded out flat, it would be the size of an extra large pizza. Again, we're not doing a cooking show here, but the food references are helpful. The cerebral cortex is divided into 4 parts or lobes, and as you can see, they're named there on the slide. So the frontal lobe in red is right in the front. The parietal is on the side. Temporal is here, and occipital is in the back. So what do these lobes do? Well, the frontal, which is Latin for forehead, is the largest region of our cortex. It's associated with reasoning, planning, parts of speech, voluntary movement, modulating emotions, and it converts thoughts into words, and it's also responsible for problem solving. It's thought also to be the most significant lobe for personality and intelligence. It has 2 specialized regions. One is the prefrontal cortex, which is right in the front, and it's very important in its role in higher cognitive functions, including controlling emotions, which is linked to the limbic system, which I will be talking about. It also thinks about the future, and it's also involved in dopamine pathways associated with pleasure. The second specialized region of the frontal lobe is the motor cortex, which is responsible for fine motor skills. The next lobe is the parietal lobe, which is Latin for wall, because it actually butts up against, if you can see on that slide, you see the frontal lobe, which is kind of purple in this slide, and the parietal lobe is yellow, so it's just called the wall. It creates a wall between the frontal and the parietal. It's associated with sensory perception like movement, recognition, perception of visual information. It basically tells us spatially and auditorily where and what things are based on memory, so we recognize them, and so they have meaning. It allows us to understand the written and spoken language. It also has a specialized region called the somatosensory cortex, which receives signals related to sensations such as taste, touch, pressure, judgment of fine sensation, of texture, weight, size, and shape. So if you're cooking at home and you pick up a heavy pot, your parietal lobes are basically translating the information of the weight of it, the steam that's coming off of your face, and it's also translating the visual cues about that information. The temporal lobes is the next lobe, which is Latin for temples, conveniently so, located here, and it's associated with perception of short-term memory. It perceives speech and sound using a specialized region called the auditory cortex. It allows a person to tell one smell from another and one sound from another. The right lobe is involved in visual memory from pictures and faces. The left lobe is involved in verbal memory for words and names. So if you meet a new person and then they go away and then they come back and you try to remember their name, but you recognize them,